Good evening. This is Pastor Barbara, aka Preacher with Parrots. Today is the 4th of March. I ought to take just a second to adjust some cameras. We're going to start our Bible study for this evening. For those that are watching the video only, you know that I'm taping a live broadcast also. And we had 2 baby birds hatch this morning, and we've spent pretty much an hour messing with that. So we're a little late getting started. This is Wednesday night, so being Wednesday night, we're in the Old Testament, and we're in the story of Solomon. Sunday nights, we're in the New Testament, and we're in the book of Romans, and Sunday morning, doing something I haven't done on the internet in all these years, and that's just preach whatever I want to. I have just concentrated on a Bible study going straight through. And now that we've been through once, you know, there's been a couple of things that I've wanted to talk about, and that gives me, doing it this way, gives me the opportunity to do that. We're in talking about Solomon now. When we finish the story, and we're going through the Reese's chronological Bible, of course, we started studying Solomon as we completed our study of David. From there, we then went into the book of Proverbs. We finished with the book of Proverbs. I want to do a little bit of the history, which is the rise and fall of King Solomon. And when we finish with that, we have 2 more books written by him. One is the book of Ecclesiastes, and it's very similar to the book of what am I trying to say? The book of wisdom, the book of literature, the book of Proverbs. We also have a shorter verse book, Song of Solomon, and when we do that, I'm going to go through it rather quickly, and when we do it, we'll go through it just in one evening. The events and the 2 books in the Bible that give us the events, which give us the chronological history of Solomon, are found in 2nd Chronicles and in 1st Kings. So I'm going to deal with this the same way I did in the Gospels, when we have 2, 3, or maybe even 4 books giving us the same event. Instead of reading them both to you, I will pick the one that is the longest and go through that one. There's no reason in the world to give you the exact same thing twice. 17 years have gone by now since Solomon began his building program. As you will remember, David wanted to build the temple. David was like the man who did so much of the Vatican. He was an architect. He was a musician. He was a painter. Of course, he was also a shepherd. He was also a military person. Because of his work with the military, God told him he would not allow him to build the temple. Personally, I would have thought it was because of his sin. David's sin was pretty serious. having been on the roof of his palace and looking down on the roof of the home next to his, he saw Bathsheba bathing. He sent for her. She came up. She became with child that very night. They found out that her husband was in the military, wanted him to come home, possibly to make it appear that the child she was carrying, since there was no DNA, belonged to him. But since he didn't go home, and we won't retry that same event again, David felt it necessary then to see that he be put up at the head of the line, and that he was actually killed, murdered. That child did not live. But Bathsheba became David's most beloved wife. And as they grieved together in their sadness for the death of this child, Solomon was conceived. We have just come to the 7th chapter of 2nd Chronicles. We've read it before, but I'm going to read it again because it's so fantastic. After the fantastic dedication of the temple, the last few days I've mentioned a couple of times about how Abraham took Isaac up to the mountain to offer him. And I've mentioned that they used to have a little clay thing that they would carry fire in. So if they needed to make a fire, they had fire there. Well, when the temple was dedicated, fire came down from heaven, just like it did on Mount Carmel, and consumed all those sacrifices. It was, the blessings of God were so great, so fantastic. Somebody said to God, all right, what happens now if we ever lose this? Because their history had been, they stopped serving God, God stopped blessing them. They would go back to serving him again. Again, his blessing would come, and they said, what's going to happen? The blessing of God is so great now, and the power of the Holy Spirit is so great, the priests couldn't even minister. They just fell to the floor. What do we do if we ever lose this? How do we get it back? And the answer is, the Lord appeared to him one night and gave him the answer. In 2 Chronicles 7:12, and the Lord appeared to Solomon by night and said unto him, I've heard your prayer, and I've chosen this place to myself for a house of sacrifice. Remember that. Remember that God chose that temple just as he originally had chosen the tabernacle. He now chose the temple as the place for sacrifice. It's going to be important in the next few minutes, because we're going to see Solomon go someplace else with the sacrifice. I have chosen this place to myself for a house of sacrifice. If I shut up heaven and there is no rain, or if I command the locusts to devour the land, or if I send a pestilence on my people. In other words, if you stop serving me, and I have to bring this to your attention, by withholding rain or sending locusts or something to eat up your crops. Then my people which are called by my name will humble themselves, pray, seek my face, turn from their wicked ways. Those four things. My people humble themselves, pray, seek my face. Then will I hear from heaven, forgive their sin, heal their land. He goes on to say, for I've sanctified this house, that my name may be there forever, and my eyes and my heart shall be there perpetually. We can go over now to verse 19. He gives them a little bit more, and we have just a couple verses of it. But if you turn away and forsake my statutes, this is really important because we're about to see where this is exactly what Solomon does. He says, if you turn away and forsake my statutes and my commandments, which I have set before you, and you go and you serve other gods and worship them. This is exactly what Solomon's getting ready to do. Then I will pluck them up by the roots out of my land which I've given them. What's he talking about? He gave them the land of Canaan. It is now known as Israel. These promises are good for one time or forever, usually. He said, if you forsake my statutes, your name, it will be a proverb, it'll be a byword in all nations. And this house, this fantastic temple that they've dedicated, which is high, it had double the proportions of the tabernacle, except for the height. It was much more than double. And people will say, why hath the Lord done this to the land and to this house, being the house of God? And it shall be answered. If people say, what's going on? Why is Israel not being blessed? Why is this temple not being blessed? If that happens, and for anybody that's following me, I'm in 2 Chronicles 7:22. And it shall be answered. Somebody says, what's going on with Israel? What's going on with God's temple? This is going to be the answer. Because they forsook the Lord God their fathers, who brought them forth out of the land of Egypt, and laid hold on other gods and worshiped them. If you don't serve me, if you mess up, and the whole world starts saying, what's going on with these people and what's happening? Why is this temple no longer a big deal? This is the answer. You might as well prepare the answer to give them. Because they forsook God, the God which brought them out of the land of Egypt. They laid holds of other gods and they worshiped them. And that's why this evil thing is brought upon them. There are some other cities which are built now. And they're built for different reasons. We're going now over into 1 Kings. And of all of his 700 wives and 300 concubines, which were also wives, they didn't inherit, their children didn't inherit like the children of the wives. That was the only difference between wives and concubines. So for all intents and purposes, he had 1,000 wives. But the main one, and many were given him when he became king, and he was only 12. But one was special, and that was the daughter of the Pharaoh of Egypt. So we're in 1 Kings 9, verse 24. But Pharaoh's daughter came up out of the city of David, that's Jerusalem, her house which Solomon built for her. Then he built Milo. We're going now because the next thing, the next event which happens is the writing of Song of Solomon. And we're going to wait and do that, not as part of the history, but separately as a separate book. So now we go over to 1 Kings chapter 9. At this point now, they have finished Song of Solomon. And we're going to talk about some forced labor. They had some slaves, which they forced to work. They also, we're going to read, charged them taxes. You remember that when Joshua took them across the Jordan River, and they started, well, before they started their conquest of the various cities, first thing they did was to circumcise all the males that had been born during that 40 years that they were wandering around in the wilderness and couldn't stop every time there was a baby to be circumcised on the 8th day. So there were a lot of males that weren't circumcised. They circumcised that because that was a commandment. They read the prophets and the law, and they had a convocation. They had the revival meeting. And having gotten themselves spiritually ready now, they are now ready for the conquest. One of the things they were told not to do was to have anything to do with the people in that land. Now, it didn't mention the surrounding countries and cities at that time, but it said the people who live in Canaan, and it gave us a number of the Hittites, the Canaanites, and a bunch of other ites. They had to be taken out of the land or they had to be killed. And this comes up in almost every sermon I've preached in the last couple of months. The reason is they had to be a separate people. Sunday morning, I think, I talked about Paul's commands in the New Testament not to be unequally wed. Meaning, and the language that they used was not to be unequally yoked. And we talked about that yoke being that wooden deal that hooked the two animals together so that one wouldn't be going this way and another the other way, but it kept them so that whatever one of them did, both did. And it's the only way you can get a job done, whether it's a marriage, whether it's in a business partnership, or whatever you're trying to accomplish. The two have to have the same goals, the same purpose, and so forth. And God knew that the minute And it wasn't a matter of the Jews or the Israelites or Abraham's offspring being better than another people. It was a matter of being different. God's people were a different people. And the whole purpose of not intermarrying with either those from other countries or those in the land God was giving them was to get those people out of them. If he's going to put the Jews there and they're not to intermarry with the other people, then the other people have got to go. And it was just that simple. Well, the problems we have right now, some of them Netanyahu addressed last night, are because they didn't get them all out of the land. Instead, they thought, oh, well, we have them here. Our forefathers didn't get them out of the land, so certainly we can't be expected to do that. That's not our job. That was Joshua's job, and he didn't do it. So what will we do? Well, this is how they handled it. First of all, they made some cities. Let's mention those. 1 Kings 9:16. For Pharaoh, king of Egypt, had gone and taken Gezer and burned it with fire. He burned up one whole city. And he slain the Canaanites that dwelt in the city. And he gave that city as a present to his daughter, Solomon's wife. Nice father-in-law. And Solomon built Gezer and Beth Horon, the nether, and he mentions some other cities in the wilderness, and all the cities of store that Solomon had. He built cities for his chariots, for example. And he had cities for his horsemen to live in. And that which Solomon desired to build in Jerusalem and in Lebanon and in all the land of his dominion. We're going to go over in a little bit. We've done it before, but we'll do it quickly again. All the land that he dominated. It speaks of him being king over all of the people to the river. You say, what river? Well, out here I live in Southern California. We talk about going to the beach. We're not going to the Atlantic Ocean out here. We're going to the Pacific coast. When you're talking about the river in the Mideast, you're talking about the Euphrates. And that was way beyond the borders of Israel. Then it mentions the sea. What sea is it talking about? Not the Dead Sea. When it speaks of it's not talking about the Sea of Galilee, because Galilee is fresh water. I don't know why they call it a sea. Somebody is going to try to correct me and say, well, if it's a sea, it's got to be salt water. It's not. Somebody just misnamed it. It's also called Lake Gennesaret. There's a misnomer of the sea, but when they say sea, they're talking about the Mediterranean Sea, which is salt water like an ocean. Let me go now to I didn't mark this, but it's something I think I need to read. 2 Chronicles 8. Solomon offered burnt offerings unto the Lord on the altar of the Lord, which he had built before a porch. And after a certain rate every day, offering according to the commandment of Moses on the Sabbaths, and on the new moons, and on the solemn feasts 3 times in a year, even in the feast of unleavened bread, Feast of Unleavened Bread is the feast that comes a week before the Feast of Passover. And he appointed, according to the order of David his father, all the priests and their services and what each tribe and what the family of this one and the family of the other should go. Now we go to 1 Kings 9. I'm going to read just a couple of verses before we get on with the Queen of Sheba. All the work of Solomon was prepared unto the day of the foundation of the house of the Lord, and until it was finished, so the house of the Lord was perfected. Now, Solomon becomes not only the smartest man in the world, but the richest man in the world. 1 Kings 9:26. King Solomon made a navy of ships of Ezion-Geber, which is beside Eloth, on the shore of the Red Sea, down at the bottom of the Garden of Eden, getting pretty close to where they dumped Osama bin Laden's body. Am I right? Dogwood, would you check for me the Red Sea? Is that up north in Europe, or is it over? Would you check that out for me? They brought gold and silver, ivory, and apes and peacocks. The peacocks I understand, the apes I don't understand. And Huram sent by the hands of the servants ships and servants. They had knowledge of the sea. They went with the servants of Solomon to Ophir and took thence 450 talents of gold, and they brought them to the king. And the king's ships went to Tarshish with the servants of Huram every 3 years. Once came the ships of Tarshish, bringing gold and silver, ivory, apes, and peacocks. Now we go to 1 Kings 10. We have the Queen of Sheba. There are different opinions when you go through history as to exactly what she was queen of and what territory it was. So rather than try to figure out which of the various accounts from historians I think are correct, I'm just going to read what the Bible says and leave it at that. Her kingdom was, as far as its relationship to what is now Israel, it is over more into what was Egypt and going over toward where Saudi Arabia is. When this Queen of Sheba heard of the fame of Solomon, now remember, he's the richest and the smartest. You heard of the wise men. You know that Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were wise men. They were young. Nebuchadnezzar wanted to consider them for a special training program where they would be taught everything from the arts to what we call the black arts, astrology, as well as astronomy. Remember the wise men that followed the star to Bethlehem? Remember they wanted to give Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego special food so that they would be extra healthy. They were going to invest a great deal in their education and in their knowledge. Remember that even Rome had its wise men, because when the wise men that came to worship Jesus came to Herod and said, "Where is he born King of the Jews?" he called his own wise men in and says, "Oh no, where? You tell me." And they had enough sense to look into the Old Testament. See, the Old Testament was completed before the birth of Christ. There's 400 years between the end of Malachi and the beginning of Matthew. It was finished being written when Malachi, 400 years before Christ, was written, but it took another 200 years to copy and translate into what became the Greek version, which we know as the Septuagint. But the Old Testament was complete at the time of Christ. And so they looked into the Old Testament. The Roman wise men looked into the Old Testament and found the prophecy that Bethlehem of Judah was where the King of the Jews would be born. This thing of there being wise men, there really were, and they really were wise. They had all kinds of knowledge, all kinds of formulas in their brains. Solomon discovered certain facts that had not been previously known about botany and plants and some things about animals. People came from around the world to listen to him talk. I should be so lucky. And when the queen of Sheba heard of the fame of Solomon concerning the name of the Lord, she came to prove him with hard questions. And she came to Jerusalem with a great train, lots of people, lots of servants. She had camels that bear spices and gold and precious stones. And she came to Solomon. She communed with him. They talked. They became friends. And she told him all that was in her heart, everything she knew, everything she thought. What do you think about this, Solomon? And Solomon told her all of her questions. She was not able to ask a question of Solomon. And I'm sure before she ever left her country that they really had prepped her. There was not one question she could ask him he couldn't answer. There was not anything hid from the king which he told her not. And when the queen of Sheba saw all of Solomon's wisdom and the house that he built and the meat of his table, the food that was served, how many servants sat in attendance, how many of his ministers and their apparel, the clothes that all the people in his cabinet wore, and his cupbearers, and his ascent by which he went up into the house of the Lord. It was a beautiful entrance of stairs going into the temple. There was no more spirit in her. She was just, I can't believe it. And she said to the king, "It's a true report that I heard in my own land of your acts and your wisdoms, all the things that you do, and all the wisdom you have." She couldn't believe it. "Howbeit, I believed not the words until I came." I didn't think anybody could be that rich. I didn't think anybody could be that smart. I don't think anybody could know all of that. And then I came. Verse 7, and my eyes saw it, and behold, the half was not told me. They ain't come anywhere near telling me about your wisdom and your wealth and your fame. The half has not been told. Happy are the men, happy are your servants, which stand continually before thee. I'm here. Send me. What do you want? I'm here to do your bidding. And those that come to stand and just listen to hear your wisdom. Blessed be the Lord thy God, which is delighted in thee, to get thee on the throne of Israel, because the Lord loved Israel forever. Therefore made he thee king to do judgment. God loved these people so much, he gave them you to be king. Well, it's not going to be that long before he falls flat on his face. And she gave the king 120 talents of gold, of spices, of great store, precious stones. There came no more such abundance of spices as those which the queen of Sheba gave him. She even gave him certain trees which had not been grown in that part of the country before. And there are that. Where I live now, I live in the mountains, but I live in Southern California, and there are trees which are not native to Southern California. But because I live in the mountains and we have 4 seasons, where you only have 2 seasons when you get closer to the ocean and closer to the deserts. But because we have the 4 seasons up here, there are trees that I remember from where I grew up in Michigan, and things like lilacs and things you don't see in other places of California that you can see up here. They're not native, but the land is such that you can bring those things from other parts of the U.S. and plant them here, and they survive and they do very well. I think the dogwood tree might be an example of that. And the navy also of Hiram that brought gold from Ophir, and they brought in from Ophir great and plenty almug trees and precious stones. And the king made of the almug trees pillars for the house of the Lord and for the king's house. This is what he did of the wood. I think we have seen those original harps. There's one in the Temple Institute, and I believe I brought and played for you something from YouTube, and we saw one of those original of David's harps. Well, he took this particular wood that the Queen of Sheba brought him, and he made harps and psalteries for the singers, for music for the singers. There came no such almug trees, nor were seen unto this day. And King Solomon gave unto the Queen of Sheba, he gave her gifts too. She did not go back empty-handed. Gave her of his royal bounty. So she turned and went to her own country, she and her servants. Okay. I'm going over now to 1 Kings 4. more of his wealth. And Solomon had 40,000 stalls for horses. 40, his horses. 40,000 stalls of horses for his chariots. And 12,000 horsemen to drive his chariots around, his personal chariots. Backing up now to verse 21. And Solomon reigned over all the kingdoms from the river, that would be the Euphrates. In the land of the Philistines lived then. Remember, the giant that David killed was a Philistine, Goliath. They lived in the land which some Palestinians are living in now. And they're on the extreme western side of the south central portion of Israel, which is on the Mediterranean Sea. So from the Mediterranean Sea, although it doesn't say that, but that's where the Philistines lived, on the shores. Just like here in Southern California, we're on the shores of the Pacific Ocean. So all the way from the Mediterranean, and when you go from there, if you go north, you go into Europe. If you go south, you go into Africa. If you go west, you go into Europe, into the lower part of Europe, like Spain and Portugal and so forth. All the way over to where I believe east meets Mideast by the Euphrates River. He reigned over all the kingdoms. And they, all the people that lived in this vast area, we're not talking about little old Israel. He ruled over a good part of Europe, Africa, the Mideast, to the border of Egypt, and they brought presents and served Solomon all the days of his life. He had dominion over all the region of this side of the river, and there were peace on all sides. There were no wars. Naturally, they loved him. They weren't at war with anybody, and nobody was at war with anybody. Judah and Israel were many as the sand by the sea, and the multitude of eating, drinking, and making merry. They had a constant party. Now, what about poverty? Was there any poverty at the time of Solomon? I'm in 1 Kings 4:25. And Judah and Israel, Judah is the southern part of Israel, and Israel is the upper part. They dwelt safely. No crime. Every man under his vine and under his fig tree. Everybody had wealth, had a garden. I want to read something. I had asked Dogwood, Red Sea is south between Egypt and Saudi Arabia. Modern Israel has just a tiny toehold on the Red Sea. Okay, thank you. Thank you, one of our guests. Okay. Now, so, I mean, this is like, you know, I was a kid during the Second World War. I remember we had air raids only because I lived near a big city. They had them in Europe. we had them because I lived near Detroit, and there was no radar. And the only way the Japanese and the Germans knew what they were flying over was to fly over at night. If they saw lights, they were over a big city. If they didn't, they assumed they were over farmland and not anything you would want to bomb. And so we had to practice living with our lights turned off. And we had air raid sirens. We've got a few of those up here on the mountain. When I, right after Rose passed away, I joined the Fire Safe Council. And we were always looking for ways to prevent forest fires and the best ways of getting people off the mountain in case we had a forest fire. And we finally came up with the reverse 911 system. Instead of us calling 911, 911 is able to call us. They know that a fire is going to be in a certain area, and they're able to telephone everybody in that area. But one of the things that we considered was the old air raid wardens, old air raid sirens that they had up here on the mountain from way back during that time. In Judah, they dwelt safely. Every man had his own garden from Dan to Beersheba. Dan is, I'm going to get this backwards, I'm afraid. It's one of the most northern cities, and Beersheba is one of the most southern. So that's like saying from Canada to Mexico, or from Los Angeles to New York, from one extreme of the country to the other. All the days of Solomon. He reigned 40 years. Now, when David reigned, he was battling Saul. There were wars. But during all the 40 years, because Saul reigned 40, David reigned 40, Solomon reigned 40. During the 40 years of Solomon, even Dan to Beersheba, Israel dwelt safely, and every man had his own garden. From Dan to Beersheba. And he reigned over all the kings from the river even to the land of Philistines. This is 2 Chronicles saying the same thing I just read from 1 Kings. 1 Kings 4:34. And there came all of the people to hear the wisdom of Solomon. Who came? All the kings of the earth which had heard of his wisdom. Came from all over, just hear him talk and answer questions and explain things he knew about so many things. And God gave Solomon wisdom and understanding. For he was wiser, this is 1 Kings 4:31, he was wiser than all the men, than Ethan the Ezrahite, I don't know who he was or why he was so small, and Haman, he was the chief musician, and Shelcol and Darda, and his fame was in all nations round about. And he spake of trees, from the cedar tree that's in London. Oh, this one, this is going to get you right here. You remember that when Christ died on the cross, they offered him wine and gall. And we even had a discussion on this as to whether it was to cut down on the pain and so forth. And remember that I told you that hyssop is a weed. It looks to me like a broom because it has the grassy stuff on the top, and then it has a long stalk. And That's what they put the wine and the gall on when they offered it to the people. And remember I told you that when I was at the Wailing Wall, which is the western wall, see, the temple was destroyed, but you've been to buildings that have been destroyed. And there's usually a wall or two walls or something left. Well, there's one wall of the temple that was not destroyed. It's the western wall. It's the wall that some of the Jews go to pray to 5 times a day. And they didn't have this when I was there in '67, but I see it now in pictures. They have plastic lawn chairs. I guess they're lawn chairs. They're plastic chairs. You get them for about $10-12 in hardware stores and in grocery stores and places like that. They have them there for the older people that go to pray. Well, hyssop grows out of the western wall of the temple. He spoke of trees, from the cedar tree that's in Lebanon unto the hyssop that springeth out of the wall. He knew everything about all kinds of plants. He spake of all kinds of beasts and fowl. Fowl, you got your turkey, you got your chicken. Creeping things, fishes, you know, that sounds pretty much like my house. And he spake 3,000, this is what he wrote, 3,000 proverbs. And his songs were 1,005. He wrote some psalms. And among those are Psalm 88, 89, and then we have done the book of Proverbs, so I'm going through them. You'll see me going through a lot of pages because there are 31 Proverbs. And we get to the end of the Proverbs, and I've got just a few minutes, just about enough time to bring us to where his problems began. And we go to 1 Kings 11. And you know his problem was women, right? 7,000 wives, 700 wives, 300 concubines. But King Solomon loved many strange women. Now, by strange, I don't think we mean weird body parts and so forth. Strange in that they were not of his nationality and faith. Together with the daughter of Pharaoh, women of the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Zidonians, and Hittites. The Moabites, Ammonites, and Edomites are those 3 countries that when they wanted to go into the promised land, they wouldn't let them go in. They are on the eastern border. One of them is now Jordan. I believe that's Edom. They would not let them go through their country. He even said, we'll bring our own water, we'll bring our own food. All we want to do is walk over your land to get to the land we want to go to, and some of them wouldn't let him do that. So here is a man who is such a peacemaker and so loved by everybody in the world that the whole world is at peace. Even these countries that originally would not let them go through to get to the land which they then possessed. That was the Moabites, the Ammonites, and the Edomites. And then, ye shall not go into them, shall not marry them, neither shall they come in unto you, which means don't send our women your men, and vice versa. For surely they will turn away your heart after their gods. 1,000 wives from other countries and of other religious faiths. And Solomon clave unto these in love. 1 Kings 11:2. That was Solomon's problem. Verse 3. He had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart. For it came to pass when Solomon was old, well, we got from youth all to old real soon, that his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not perfect with the Lord and his God, as was the heart of David his father. David sinned. He not only lusted, he already had wives, but he lusted for somebody else's, got her pregnant, got her husband killed. The son died. But David loved God. And even though he was an embarrassment to God, after he sinned, he turned right around and went right back to serving God. Because that was David's heart. And that was not Solomon's heart. It came to pass that when he is old, his heart went after other gods, and his heart was not perfect with the Lord his God as the heart of David his father. For Solomon went after Ashtoreth. Ashtoreth was the female god. There are a lot of fake gods. You've heard of Baal and other gods. Ashtoreth was like Diana later. The goddess of the Zidonians, and after Ilnacum, the abomination of the Ammonites. And Solomon did evil in the sight of the Lord. What is the evil that he did? He went not fully after the Lord as David his father. He went after the Lord, but not fully the way his father had. I'm going to end right here. I want to check on the baby birds. Today is 3/4/15. Got to write the date here. Okay. And I'm going to close the video that we're making. So till the next video, blessings on you.